In September 1939, the world changed forever. Without warning, German forces stormed into Poland, unleashing a new kind of war built on speed, firepower, and fear. Tanks rolled through villages at dawn. Fighter planes screamed across dark skies. Within weeks, Poland fell, and the illusion of lasting peace collapsed. World War II had begun. For the United States and Canada, the war at first felt distant, an ocean away. Newspapers carried black and white photographs of burning cities and fleeing civilians. Radio voices spoke of blitzkrieg, occupation, and surrender. Many hoped the conflict would remain a European tragedy, but history was already pulling North America toward a global fight. By 1940, Nazi Germany controlled much of Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, battered by relentless air raids. Night after night, London burned as civilians crowded into shelters, listening for the sound of bombs. Across the Atlantic, American leaders watched closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood a hard truth. If Britain fell, democracy itself would be at risk. The United States was not yet at war, but it was no longer neutral. Factories began to wake up. Steel mills roared back to life. Shipyards filled with workers building destroyers, cargo ships, and aircraft. Through the Lend-Lease program, America sent weapons, food, and supplies to Britain and its allies. Canada, already at war, became a critical training ground, preparing pilots, soldiers, and sailors for the battles ahead. Meanwhile, the Axis powers pushed forward. In 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening the largest and bloodiest front in human history. Millions of soldiers clashed across frozen fields and ruined cities. The scale of death shocked even seasoned generals. Victory, it became clear, would demand total commitment. Then came December 2, 1941. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Sailors fought for their lives in oil-filled waters. By the next day, the United States was at war. Canada stood firm beside its neighbor. The road to victory would be long, brutal, and costly, but there was no turning back. This was the beginning of a united, industrial and military effort unlike anything the world had ever seen. Farmers, factory workers, soldiers, and families would all become part of the war. The road to victory had opened, not with triumph, but with sacrifice and the understanding that freedom would have to be fought for, inch by inch. After Pearl Harbor, the war became personal for Americans and Canadians alike. Recruitment offices overflowed. Young men lined up, some barely out of school, ready to cross oceans they had never seen. Women stepped into factories, hangars, and shipyards, building the weapons that would decide the future. This was no longer a distant war. It was a total war. In 1942, the Axis powers still seemed unstoppable. Japan surged across the Pacific, capturing islands with shocking speed. Wake Island fell. The Philippines collapsed under relentless attack. American and Canadian forces were pushed back, forced to learn hard lessons under fire. The early months were filled with retreat, loss, and doubt. But the tide began to shift. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway became a turning point. American intelligence cracked Japanese codes, allowing U.S. naval forces to strike first. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were destroyed. It was a decisive blow. For the first time, Japan was on the defensive. The road to victory, though still long, was now visible. In Europe, the Allies focused on survival and preparation. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking supply ships at an alarming rate. The ocean itself became a battlefield. Canadian naval escorts and American destroyers hunted submarines day and night, slowly turning the tide. Convoys began to make it through. Supplies reached Britain. Hope followed steel and fuel. On land, Allied forces launched their first major offensive against Germany in North Africa. In 1942, American troops entered combat against experienced German units. The fighting was brutal, and mistakes were costly. But with each battle, the Allies learned. Coordination improved. Leadership strengthened. The enemy could be beaten. Back home, the industrial miracle accelerated. By 1943, the United States was producing planes faster than they could be flown into combat. Tanks rolled off assembly lines in endless numbers. Canada became known as the arsenal of democracy's partner, supplying food, vehicles, and trained aircrews. This overwhelming production would become one of the Allies' greatest weapons. The war was still far from over. Casualty lists grew longer. Families waited by radios and mailboxes, clinging to hope. Yet something had changed. The Axis advance had been stopped. The Allies were no longer reacting, they were planning. The road to victory was being paved not by a single battle, but by endurance, by coordination, by the unbreakable belief that freedom, once threatened, must be defended at any cost. By 1943, the war entered a new and decisive phase. The Allies no longer fought just to survive. Now, they fought to advance. In Europe, the first cracks appeared in the Axis alliance. After heavy defeats in North Africa, Allied forces crossed the Mediterranean and invaded Italy. Cities that once echoed with speeches and parades now shook under artillery fire. Italy's government collapsed, and although German forces continued to fight, the myth of Axis invincibility was broken. At the same time, a new kind of warfare intensified in the skies. Allied bombers flew deep into enemy territory, day and night. American crews carried out daylight precision bombing, while British aircraft struck under cover of darkness. Factories, rail yards, and oil facilities became targets. The cost was high. Crews faced flak, fighter attacks, and freezing altitudes. Many never returned. Yet these missions slowly crippled Germany's ability to wage war. On the Eastern Front, the scale of combat remained staggering. In 1943, the Battle of Kursk erupted, the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of armored vehicles clashed in violent, close-range combat. When the smoke cleared, Germany had lost its last chance to regain the initiative. From that point forward, Soviet forces pushed west relentlessly. The German army was bleeding men and machines faster than it could replace them. Across the Atlantic, preparation for the final blow intensified. The United States and Canada trained millions of soldiers for an invasion that would decide the war in Europe. Camps filled with landing craft drills, weapons practice, and endless rehearsals. Commanders knew that one mistake could cost tens of thousands of lives. Every detail mattered: timing, weather, secrecy. Meanwhile, the home front remained fully mobilized. American cities ran around the clock. Canadian shipyards launched vessels faster than submarines could sink them. Rationing continued, reminding civilians daily that the war demanded shared sacrifice. Victory bonds funded weapons. Posters urged silence, effort, and unity. In the Pacific, Allied forces adopted a new strategy known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held position, they targeted key islands, cutting off enemy strongholds and pushing steadily toward Japan. Battles were fierce and unforgiving. Jungle fighting tested endurance and morale, but each captured island brought airfields closer to the Japanese mainland. By late 1943, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, but the price of victory still lay ahead. The Allies had momentum, resources, and coordination. What they needed now was one decisive strike that would open the gates to liberation. The road to victory was narrowing, and every step forward carried the weight of history. June 6, 1944, before dawn, the largest invasion force in history moved across the English Channel. More than 150,000 Allied troops, American, Canadian, and British, headed toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. This moment had been planned for years. It was called D-Day, and everything depended on it. As the first waves approached Normandy, the sea was rough and the sky was heavy with clouds. Landing craft doors dropped, and soldiers stepped into chaos. Machine gun fire tore across the beaches. Mines exploded in the surf. Many men never made it past the shoreline. Omaha Beach became a scene of brutal loss, where courage was measured in seconds under fire. Yet the invasion did not fail. Small units pushed forward through sand, wire, and concrete defenses. Canadian forces stormed Juno Beach, fighting through intense resistance and moving inland faster than expected. American paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines in the darkness, regrouped and attacked key roads and bridges. Confusion was everywhere, but determination held. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. It was fragile, costly, and incomplete, but it was real. The wall guarding Fortress Europe had been broken. From that day forward, German forces would be forced to fight on multiple fronts, stretched thin against overwhelming numbers and firepower. The weeks that followed were brutal. Hedgerows turned the French countryside into deadly mazes. Progress was slow, measured in yards rather than miles. Artillery thundered day and night. Civilians hid in cellars as entire towns were reduced to rubble. Liberation came at a terrible price. In July, Allied forces broke out of Normandy. American units surged west and south, while Canadian forces pushed toward key positions around Caen. German defenses began to collapse. Retreat turned into rout. Paris was liberated in August, greeted by crowds who had waited 4 long years for freedom. Back home, the news brought both relief and sorrow. Victory in Europe was now possible, but casualty lists continued to grow. Families celebrated quietly, knowing the war was not yet over. The Pacific still burned, and Japan fought on with fierce resistance. D-Day did not end the war, but it changed everything. It proved that unity, planning, and sacrifice could defeat even the most fortified enemy. The road to victory now ran straight through Europe, and the Allies were advancing with unstoppable force. History would remember June 6, 1944, not just as an invasion, but as the moment liberation began. By late 1944, Allied forces were driving deep into Western Europe. German cities lay in ruins. Supply lines stretched across France and Belgium, feeding an army that seemed unstoppable. Many believed the war in Europe was nearly over, but the enemy was not finished. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a last, desperate gamble. Under cover of fog and snow, German forces struck through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The goal was bold: split the Allied armies, capture key ports, and force a negotiated peace. This surprise offensive became known as the Battle of the Bulge. American units, many of them inexperienced, were caught off guard. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Soldiers fought without proper winter clothing, low on food and ammunition. Entire towns changed hands in violent, close-range fighting. Bastogne became a symbol of resistance. Where surrounded, American forces refused to surrender. Canadian troops played a crucial role farther north, holding critical ground and preventing the offensive from spreading. Allied commanders reacted quickly. As the weather cleared, air power returned. Fighter bombers tore into German columns trapped on narrow roads. The tide turned once again. By January 1945, the German advance had failed. The losses were catastrophic. Germany had spent its final reserves of fuel, tanks, and trained soldiers. From that moment, defeat was inevitable. The Allies resumed their push eastward with renewed force. As armies crossed the Rhine River, they encountered the full horror of Nazi rule. Concentration camps were liberated. Prisoners emerged weak, starving, and barely alive. Soldiers who had seen years of combat were stunned into silence. The war was no longer just about territory or strategy, it was about justice. In April 1945, Allied forces closed in on Berlin from the west, while Soviet troops attacked from the east. Cities collapsed under constant bombardment. German resistance crumbled. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life in a bunker beneath the ruined capital. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The next day was declared Victory in Europe Day. Across the United States and Canada, church bells rang, crowds filled streets, strangers embraced. The war that had begun with fear and uncertainty had ended in relief and reflection. But celebration was tempered by reality. Millions were dead. Entire nations lay shattered. And far across the Pacific, the war still raged on. The road to victory in Europe had ended, but the final chapter of World War II was yet to be written. While Europe celebrated victory in May 1945, The war in the Pacific was reaching its most violent stage. Japan showed no sign of surrender. American and Canadian forces now faced an enemy willing to fight to the last man. The final road to victory would be paved with some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Island by island, Allied forces moved closer to Japan. In early 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima erupted. The island was small, but its importance was enormous. Japanese forces had turned it into a fortress, carving tunnels deep into volcanic rock. When American Marines landed, they faced relentless fire from hidden positions. Progress was measured in feet. The fighting lasted more than a month. When it ended, nearly the entire Japanese garrison was dead. The iconic flag raised on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of sacrifice, not celebration. Soon after, the Allies attacked Okinawa. This battle revealed what an invasion of Japan itself might look like. Waves of kamikaze pilots crashed into Allied ships, turning the sea into a graveyard of steel and fire. On land, soldiers fought through mud, rain, and constant artillery. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, suffering unimaginable losses. By June 1945, Okinawa had fallen, but at a staggering cost. American leaders now faced an impossible decision. Intelligence reports predicted that an invasion of Japan could cost millions of lives, both Allied and Japanese. At the same time, a secret project had reached completion. The Manhattan Project had produced a weapon unlike anything the world had ever known. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. In a single flash, the city was destroyed. 3 days later, a second bomb struck Nagasaki. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Survivors wandered through ruins in shock and silence. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. World War II was finally over. For the United States and Canada, the victory brought relief, pride, and deep sorrow. Millions of service members began the journey home. Families reunited. Factories fell silent. But the memory of the war would never fade. The road to victory had reshaped the world. It ended empires, created new superpowers, and introduced the nuclear age. For those who lived through it, victory was not just a moment in history, it was a reminder of the cost of freedom. World War II was over, but its lessons would echo for generations. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood still, trying to understand what had just happened. World War II had lasted 6 long years, but its impact would shape generations. For the United States and Canada, victory brought relief, but also responsibility. The road to victory had not ended with surrender. A new chapter was beginning. Across Europe and Asia, cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless. Railways, factories, and ports were destroyed. Food shortages threatened entire populations. Allied soldiers who once fought through fire and steel were now tasked with restoring order, distributing aid, and helping rebuild shattered nations. Victory demanded compassion as much as strength. The horrors uncovered during the war could not be ignored. The liberation of concentration camps revealed crimes on an unimaginable scale. Survivors told stories of starvation, forced labor, and mass murder. The world listened in disbelief. In response, Allied leaders pushed for justice. The Nuremberg trials put surviving Nazi leaders on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. For the first time, international law held individuals accountable for actions taken during war. At the same time, the global balance of power shifted. Europe, once the center of world politics, was weakened. In its place rose 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Canada emerged with a stronger global voice, respected for its military contribution and diplomatic role. Together, the Allies helped create new institutions designed to prevent another global catastrophe. The United Nations was formed with the hope that dialogue could replace destruction. Back home, millions of veterans returned to civilian life. They carried memories that could not be erased. Governments offered education, housing support, and jobs, helping build a new middle class. Suburbs expanded. Universities filled with former soldiers. The wartime economy transformed into a post-war boom, reshaping North American society. Yet the shadow of the war remained. The atomic bomb had ended the conflict, but it also introduced fear into the future. The nuclear age began with uncertainty and tension. The road to victory had saved the world from tyranny, but it had also revealed humanity's power to destroy itself. For Americans and Canadians, World War II became more than history. It became a reference point, a reminder of unity in crisis, of sacrifice shared across borders, of ordinary people who rose to extraordinary challenges. The road to victory was not perfect. It was not clean, but it proved one enduring truth. When freedom is threatened, cooperation and courage can change the course of history. The war ended in 1945. Its legacy still lives on. As the world moved forward after 1945, the meaning of victory continued to evolve. For the United States and Canada, World War II was no longer just a memory of battles won. It became a foundation for leadership in a fragile new world. Peace had arrived, but it was uneasy, shaped by fear, rebuilding, and unresolved tensions. In Europe, recovery was slow. Entire economies had collapsed. To prevent chaos and the spread of extremism, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1947. Billions of dollars in aid flowed into Western Europe, rebuilding factories, stabilizing currencies, and restoring trade. Canada supported these efforts through food shipments and financial assistance. This was not charity, it was strategy. Leaders understood that lasting victory required stability, not punishment. But cooperation with the Soviet Union quickly faded. Wartime allies became ideological rivals. Eastern Europe fell behind the Iron Curtain as communist governments took power under Soviet influence. In response, the United States and Canada helped form NATO, a military alliance built on collective defense. The world had entered the Cold War, an era defined not by open battle, but by tension, proxy conflicts, and the constant threat of nuclear war. At home, the memory of World War II shaped national identity. Veterans became teachers, engineers, lawmakers, and community leaders. Their experience influenced how governments planned for defense, diplomacy, and crisis response. Military readiness became a permanent priority. Lessons learned from the road to victory were written into doctrine and strategy. The war also changed culture. Hollywood films, newsreels, and books told stories of sacrifice and heroism. Black and white images of soldiers, factories, and battlefields became symbols of a generation that endured hardship and prevailed. For Americans and Canadians, World War II was remembered as a moment when democracy stood its ground against tyranny. Yet history remained complex. Victory did not erase loss. Families mourned those who never returned. Survivors carried invisible wounds. The celebration of triumph existed alongside quiet reflection. Memorials were built, not to glorify war, but to remember its cost. As decades passed, World War II moved from lived experience to recorded history, but its influence did not fade. It shaped foreign policy, military alliances, and global institutions. It defined what total war meant and why it must never be repeated. The road to victory was more than a path through battlefields. It was a journey that reshaped nations, redefined power, and challenged humanity to choose cooperation over destruction. For the United States and Canada, that legacy remains a responsibility. Victory was earned once, but its lessons must be protected forever. As the decades passed, World War II became a defining reference point for modern history. For Americans and Canadians, it was the moment when isolation ended and global responsibility began. The road to victory did not simply change borders, it reshaped how nations understood power, freedom, and leadership. The military lessons of the war were studied in detail. Generals analyzed every campaign, from Normandy to the Pacific Islands. New doctrines emerged, emphasizing joint operations between land, sea, and air forces. Technology advanced rapidly. Radar, jet engines, and early computers, all accelerated by wartime necessity, became the foundation of modern defense and civilian life. The war had forced innovation at an unprecedented pace. At the same time, society itself was transformed. Women who had worked in factories and offices during the war demanded greater opportunity. Minority soldiers who had fought for freedom abroad began questioning inequality at home. In both the United States and Canada, the seeds of future civil rights movements were planted by wartime service and sacrifice. Victory had raised expectations not just for security, but for justice. World War II also changed how future conflicts were judged. The sheer destruction of cities like Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki left a lasting moral debate. Leaders and citizens alike struggled with difficult questions. How far should a nation go to win a war? What is the cost of total victory? These questions shaped foreign policy decisions for generations. For veterans, memory was deeply personal. Reunions were filled with laughter and silence. Medals rested in drawers. Stories were told slowly, if at all. Many carried the war within them for the rest of their lives. Yet their presence in communities served as a living reminder of what had been endured to secure peace. Education became another battlefield of memory. Schools taught the war not as distant legend, but as lived history. Black and white footage showed young faces, not much older than the students watching. Museums preserved uniforms, letters, and weapons, grounding abstract history in human reality. The road to victory was no longer just written in books. It was preserved in voices and artifacts. As the 20th century ended, the last veterans began to fade from public life. Anniversaries took on new meaning. With fewer witnesses remaining, the responsibility to remember shifted to future generations. Memory became duty. World War II proved that democratic nations, when united, could overcome even the most brutal forces. But it also warned how fragile peace can be. The road to victory was hard-won and easily forgotten if its lessons are ignored. For the United States and Canada, remembrance is not about pride alone. It is about vigilance, about understanding that freedom survives only when people are willing to defend it together. Today, the road to victory is no longer walked by soldiers alone. It is carried forward by memory, responsibility, and choice. For the United States and Canada, World War II stands as a permanent reminder of what unity can achieve and what division can destroy. In the modern world, the battlefields have changed, but the stakes remain high. Democracies still face pressure from authoritarian power, misinformation, and global instability. The lessons of World War II guide decision makers who understand that early action, strong alliances, and shared values matter. The war proved that waiting too long comes at a terrible cost. Commemorations continue across North America. Veteran cemeteries are kept with care. Museums update exhibits to speak to younger generations. Anniversaries of D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and victory in Europe are marked not as celebrations of war, but as reminders of sacrifice. Each ceremony connects the present to a past written in courage and loss. Technology now allows stories to survive beyond those who live them. Recorded interviews, restored photographs, and digital archives preserve voices that once echoed across battlefields. A letter written in a foxhole, a photograph taken before a final mission, these fragments keep history human. They remind audiences that victory was built by individuals, not statistics. The United States and Canada continue to honor World War II not only through remembrance, but through action. Peacekeeping missions, humanitarian aid, and international cooperation reflect a commitment born from wartime experience. The belief is simple: peace must be maintained, not assumed. Yet remembrance also carries a warning. War begins with words, fear, and division long before the first shot is fired. World War II showed how quickly societies can be consumed by hatred when truth is ignored. The road to victory teaches that defending democracy requires vigilance in everyday life. As time moves on, the war becomes history rather than memory. That transition is dangerous if lessons fade. The responsibility now rests with storytellers, educators, and citizens to keep the meaning alive. Not to glorify violence, but to understand its cost. The road to victory was long and brutal. It crossed oceans, cities, deserts, and islands. It demanded everything from those who walked it. In the end, it secured a future where freedom had a chance to survive. For American and Canadian audiences today, World War II is more than a past conflict. It is a mirror. It asks a question that echoes through time. When history calls, will unity rise again? The answer depends on whether the road to victory is remembered, not as a destination, but as a responsibility. As World War II moves further into history, its meaning continues to deepen. For the United States and Canada, the war is no longer just a story of armies and leaders, it is a lesson about people. Ordinary citizens were pushed into extraordinary circumstances, and their choices shaped the fate of the world. One of the strongest lessons of the war is the power of unity. During the 1940s, political differences, economic struggles, and social divisions were set aside in the face of a common threat. Factories cooperated, communities organized scrap drives, families accepted rationing without complaint. Victory was not achieved by soldiers alone, but by entire nations moving in the same direction. The war also revealed the danger of silence. Before the fighting began, warning signs were ignored. Aggression was tolerated. Lies spread faster than truth. World War II proved that democracy cannot survive on hope alone. It requires action, awareness, and the courage to confront threats early. This lesson remains just as relevant in the modern world. For American and Canadian audiences, the legacy of the war is closely tied to values: freedom of speech, rule of law, respect for human life. These ideals were challenged directly by fascism and militarism. The road to victory showed that values are not self-protecting. They must be defended, sometimes at great cost. Memory plays a critical role in this defense. As eyewitnesses disappear, remembrance becomes a shared responsibility. Monuments, documentaries, and classrooms are not just about honoring the past, they are tools for the future. Forgetting makes repetition possible. Remembering creates resistance. World War II also reminds us that victory is never pure. Every triumph carried loss. Every advance left scars. Nations rebuilt, but trauma remained. A mature understanding of the war does not romanticize it. It respects the courage shown while acknowledging the suffering endured. This balance is essential for honest history. In the United States and Canada, World War II veterans are often called the greatest generation, not because they were perfect, but because they answered history's call when it mattered most. Their lives after the war, spent building communities and families, proved that strength can exist without violence. Today's world is faster, louder, and more connected than ever before. But human nature has not changed. Fear, ambition, and division still exist. The road to victory teaches that peace is fragile, and democracy demands effort. World War II does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. Its final message is simple and enduring. When freedom is threatened, unity matters more than comfort, truth matters more than silence, and responsibility matters more than convenience. That is the lasting meaning of the road to victory.